Conversations on race and policing began in response to the police killing of George Floyd on May 25, 2020. In this partnership between CSU San Bernardino and the Brennan Center for Justice, we hope to engage in ongoing discussions related to the history and current context of race, policing, and criminal justice with guests from diverse academic fields and backgrounds. Good afternoon and welcome to this week's Conversations on Race and Policing. My name is Matt Patino. I am an adjunct instructor of history at Crafton Hills College. I'm also a former police officer with the Rialto Police Department. Before we begin, I would like to read the CSUSB land acknowledgement. We recognize that the campuses of California State University San Bernardino each sit on unceded indigenous ancestral homelands. For San Bernardino, the land of the Gabrielino peoples, the Chemehuevi peoples, Serrano peoples, and the federally recognized land of the Yuaviatam of San Manuel Nation. For Palm Desert, the land of the Cahuilla peoples, and the federally recognized land of the Agua Caliente Band of Cahuilla Indians. We recognize that every member of the CSUSB community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1965. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we are responsible for acknowledging and making the university's relationship with Indigenous peoples visible. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold California State University San Bernardino more accountable to the needs of American Indians and Indigenous peoples. And now I will turn it over to my colleague, Stan Futch.
And before I introduce the guests, I'd like to thank those involved in this program. It's Amber Broaden, Jeremy Murray, Mike Berman, and I also want to thank Mary Texeira, Eric Hauser, Pamela Cross, and of course Thin, who keeps us all going. So this afternoon, I want to introduce a couple of guests, Serginho Roosblad, an Emmy Award-winning documentary filmmaker, a journalist, and photographer. He is a video producer and associate press global investigations team at the AP. Sergio has worked on a variety of investigations, short documentaries, including on policing, use of force on children, and reporting on the war in Ukraine. Also, I'd like to introduce Mike Shum, born in Denver, Colorado, is a filmmaker who specializes in cinematography and journalism. He started collaborating with the PBS Frontline in 2019 on the Wall Street Journal and PBS Frontline producer Productions, Predator on the Reservation, an investigation into Indian health services. He was the writer and director of Police on Trial, a police department in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder. He is a producer on the PBS Frontline AP collaboration documentary, Police Use of Force. Mike and Sergio.
All right, thank you so much for introducing us, and thank you everyone for joining this session this afternoon. I'd like to introduce our film documenting police use of force, which was broadcast by PBS Frontline back in April, and is part of a larger project called Lethal Restraint, which is a collaboration with the Associated Press. The film that you're about to watch is about 50 minutes, and I just wanted to put out a little bit of a warning out there. Is that some of the materials can be a little bit hard to watch. There's a lot of body camera footage of people dying in the film. So that's a little bit of a warning if you're a little sensitive to that. Unfortunately, it is part of the conversation that we're going to have later on, which I very much look forward to. I don't know if Mike has anything else to add. If not, we can head over to watch the film and have a Q&A after.
I don't. So let's just let's roll. Thank you, Serginho.
Right.
Well, thank you so much. That was a beautiful film. Um, the part, mental health, big issue in law enforcement. Um, can either of you touch on mental health and law enforcement training?
Yeah, sure. So at least what we have found is that quite often officers are not trained to deal with mental health calls, or if they are trained, it's relatively minimal. We see that officers go into, some of these incidents, assuming that someone does not want to cooperate, not knowing or not being aware that someone might be dealing with a mental health crisis at that moment. So, you can imagine if someone is in a crisis and is hearing voices or is hearing the devil or some sort of demon, and an officer comes, like, that person is not going to be able to distinguish between, what's happening in their brains and what's actually happening in that moment. So that is a relatively big problem, as we've seen throughout this project as well. One of the things that came out after this film was released and after the project that the AP published was that the Police Executive Research Forum, which is an organization that advises police departments, mostly in bigger cities, but smaller cities as well, they came out with new national guidelines, and there were about 15 of them. But one of the guidelines was that officers need to be able to identify these warning signs of medical and behavioral emergencies. So it's a step in the right direction, but most likely it will take time.
Thank you. Mike?
Yeah, no, I'm just going to echo what Serginho said. I think what the AP's investigation found was, and clearly, as just to underscore what you had highlighted, Stan, and that is the prevalence of mental health and the, call it, lack of training, but I would even go as far to say policing in general doesn't often address the whole picture when it comes to when confronting face to face with an altercation of sorts that involves mental health. This is where the importance of really reimagining how mental health professionals can be involved. I know that there are departments across the country experimenting with the use of mental health professionals in the field. And, when you create a system where there are constant interactions between police officers and law enforcement and citizens and people across the country, it's it requires a degree of care and holistic perspective that is not often trained well or supported well. And we are seeing that prevalence. We are seeing really the beginnings of understanding the wider problem of how these deaths occur within the database that the AP has built.
Thank you. I spent 35 years with the Riverside Fire Department. And one of the things I saw in the film that puzzled me is EMTs and paramedics need to take control of some of the scenes. I understand the policemen are subduing the patient, but at a certain point, the EMTs and paramedics seem to not step up. And when they had the individual on the gurney face down, at some point, the EMTs and paramedics know that's not the best position for the patient. Can you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, that is something that we noticed as well. And I mean, it could be a variety of reasons why EMTs are actually, not taking control in that moment. It could be that they are intimidated themselves, that the chaotic nature of these incidents, maybe it feels like, oh, well, actually someone else is actually in charge. this was also one of the recommendations from the new guidelines is actually, okay, when it comes to a medical situation, police officers are not the ones who should be calling the shots, almost literally. One of the things that we've seen, that the reporters have seen in their process of research and reporting, was that quite often when it comes to sedation, police officers are the ones who are calling for someone to be sedated, and we saw that also in the last case that in the film, you hear someone yelling ketamine. We're not necessarily sure who it was, but that's a very gray area, and it's not very clear oftentimes, like, who is in charge. And then it's also, means like recognizing that someone is actually in medical distress, and not necessarily not cooperating with police officers.
I think it's also difficult in a way to understand clearly, at what point paramedics and EMTs get called in, whether they're the first to respond or vice versa. I think what helps, or at least the importance of this, isn't really understanding exactly what the problems are, whether that's pecking order, whether that's intimidation. But I think it's difficult to sort of come to a conclusion as really, and this may be, sort of for myself, an organizing principle of how to answer questions about this is this database really is the beginning of that conversation, where we're able to actually see all these incidents and actually start to see, well, where did things go wrong? I mean, having perspectives like Jack Ryan and Eric Yeager to be able to go through some of this material, Roger Mitchell, to go through this material and be like, well, this is what protocol is like. This is what protocol should be. And how have those interactions unfolded over time? We have to sort of start to study, where do these things go wrong? And we identified, and Serginho, cogently and directorially honed in on Hunter Turner's case, because there was a break in policy and protocol, where clearly for EMTs, the protocol was to not keep him in supine and face down. And yet that didn't, them turning him over did not happen. Becomes less about what happened versus, well, that's a question for them. What went wrong? Is that a training thing? Because it was in their handbook to know that that's not the best position in a health emergency. There are a lot of, if anything, it brings up more questions, but really it's the beginning and starting point of that line of inquiry for us.
Thank you. One of the questions from one of the students was, is ketamine still used today? And if so, what circumstances should it be used?
Yeah, it's still being used by certain departments across the country. I mean, I think every department has like their own kind of like rules. It's not actually the police department that are actually using ketamine. It's EMTs. So it depends on what kind of like guidelines they have, whether or not they feel like it needs to be used. And as we saw in the film, former paramedic Eric Yeager was saying that the threshold of when they're going to use ketamine or any other sedative is much higher right now after the case of Elijah McClain in Colorado, where they've realized, okay, it's not like a necessarily go-to, but we really need to have like a much higher threshold.
Ketamine versus Narcan. What's
Narcan?
Narcan is being used when someone is overdosing, and ketamine is kind of like bringing someone down, making sure that they can are calm and that they can either collaborate or cooperate with law enforcement and or be transported to a hospital or other facility.
Mary?
Hi, I'm sure my colleagues welcomed you and thanked you for being with us today. You all are busy people, so we really, really appreciate it. I think it was Mike who used the term pecking order when it comes to the scene of the crime or the scene of the incident. And I'm happy to say that I haven't seen the George Floyd video in about a year, but I did see it, as we all did, many, many times. And I recall that the paramedics conceded to the police officers. And one would think in a medical situation, that cops would step back as long as no one's getting hurt and cede to the medical establishment. Yet that didn't happen. And I don't know if there's been a discussion about that or what. And additionally, there was another off-duty paramedic at the scene, a young woman who I'm not sure if she tried to intervene or what, but she did testify. I know she testified. What are your thoughts on this sort of pecking order between the medical establishment or the medical personnel and police officers?
Yeah, I think Mike can answer the matter of Minneapolis and George Floyd a little better, as he made an entire film about that and analyzed that story. So I'll just give it to Mike.
Oh yeah, no problem. No, I think I wouldn't say no problem so much as I think it's important to recognize a couple things. When I mentioned pecking order, I do think inherently within structures built mainly on law enforcement, but I'll use Minneapolis as that's who we're talking about as the example, given George Floyd's murder specifically. Oh, apologies. The light towards me. I'll make sure it's nice. There's a paramilitary structure in place already, foundationally speaking. Minneapolis is very much subject to that. To that end, I'd like to be careful to say that there's a natural pecking order built in, but if I were to sort of speculate based on the body cam footage as well as talking to law enforcement members of Minneapolis Police Department, there is in many of these interactions, there is a sort of sense of, well, if EMTs go into a situation, to what extent is the situation safe? Now, the logic there plays in two different directions. One, I would argue, is the care of the person and the well-being and care of the person who's the subject of the altercation or interaction. And on the other end is the staff, i.e. the law enforcement or EMTs, who are in the middle of that situation. And just empirically speaking, I would argue, you do start to see that it's hard to explain whether it's pecking order so much as, well, what's the safety level of the situation and where do we throw the deference towards? And at least I can say for Minneapolis, there is a degree of, well, law enforcement there for the longest time has had a lot of hands-on training approach, clearly as the consequences have led to the death of George Floyd, but the hands-on approach creates a sense of what's necessary in order to control the situation. Obviously, we see consequences in that, and that's the part where I would even go still as far, and I hope this is not too much of a repeat, but it is still unclear the patterns of these processes and these dynamics between EMT and law enforcement in these situations, which is why it's important for us to be able to look at all these situations across the country and say, well, which have less control or power, or where are there pecking orders, or where is this information? I guess more importantly, how can this information be informative to law enforcement agencies to say, hey, look, there is an issue here about the dynamics between EMT and law enforcement in your county or in your municipality. And that's part of hopefully a generative impact approach that can help law enforcement look at their own departments and say, maybe we need more mental health professionals. Maybe we need to figure out this paramilitary situation. These are a number of questions that we can at least ask now with that particular, these various data points that we're able to point to. But the only thing I'd like to add on to this is, it's a pleasure, Mary, and thank you so much for just having us here. We talked about being able to talk about our film for some time now, so I'm just honored and happy to be here with you.
Michael German.
Thanks, guys, for a great film, great journalism, putting all that together. And I think that the point you made that the data was really important to understanding these events. The fact that there isn't an official data collector, and Are you still collecting that data? Number one, and number two, have any federal agencies contacted you about getting it, or any other entities?
That's a good question. Like, indeed, it is a story about data, and kind of like see this as not necessarily, pointing fingers towards law enforcement, saying like you're doing this wrong, you do that wrong, but basically looking at, and I think Mike has mentioned it a couple of times. Okay, what is happening? Where is it happening? How do these interactions unfold? Who is in charge when these interactions kind of like go sideways? And so having the data will be super powerful. And so the hope is, and we see this also as a public service, the hope is that someone will take this data and then eventually, whether it's developing policies or doing something else with it, that's kind of like the best thing that could come out of this. And we have not been, contacted by federal agencies, but we've had, like I mentioned earlier already, that the National Executive Research Forum, Police Executive Research Forum, already came out with new national guidelines, identifying the warning signs of medical behavioral emergencies, also kind of like warning officers that, if you're using a taser multiple times, that can carry a risk that, again, we talked about it earlier, that a supervisor or someone else needs to take control, that prone restraint carries risk, and that the ability to speak doesn't necessarily mean that someone can actually properly breathe. These are things that at one hand you could say like, oh, I mean, it sounds pretty, straightforward. So it should be known, or should have been known. For example, like the fact that prone carries risk. But it turns out, as we've seen in the reporting, that that's not the case. So it's a good thing that, our film and our project came out, and there's like, renewed attention for this, and that there are organizations out there that have taken our work and kind of like moved in the right direction. There was also the Center for Policing Equity that has taken the data that the AP put together and kind of like made their own analysis. And through that, they identified novel evidence suggesting that the coroner and sheriff coroner jurisdictions were especially unlikely to categorize in-custody deaths as homicides, and that those incidents often occurs in highly Republican counties, according to their analysis using our data. So it's pretty hopeful to see that in that sense. And there were a couple of other things in terms of impact that happened. The training courses by the trainer that is in the film here in California, his trainings have been stopped, at least for now, and they're kind of like reevaluating what to do there. And the family of Hunter Turner, the family we saw in the beginning, they have decided, now that they finally know the truth about what happened that night, that they are suing law enforcement. They filed a federal case back in August. There's still questions whether or not, questions around statutes of limitation. It took them 20 different lawyers and then finally the 20th said yes, but it took a while for them to find someone to represent their case, and so now they're finally moving forward. So we'll see what will come out of that.
I was in policing for a number of years before I got into sociology in the university, and I was shocked from this film as to how many cops are medical experts. They can tell you, they can figure out just from the breathing what's going on, or they can inject people with life-saving medicines. And I think the policing reform is suggesting that a situation like the young man at the all of these mental health, they should have called there should be someone standing by some mental health, and we've seen it works in other places. Did you run across any resistance to that? Did you run across any discussion of, this should not have been the cops' job? They should have called mental health experts. They're not experts in this. They don't know any. There's no mental health covered in the academy. No mental health discussion covered in the academy. No disability. You run across a deaf person, and you see him as being resistant, and so it escalates. So, what are your thoughts on that?
It's actually pretty interesting that you mentioned deaf. I was talking to some colleagues, and one of them was actually going back to our database because it was not something that they had looked for. And it turned out there are 7 cases in our database, at least, where the person was deaf, or at least there was a mention of them being deaf or hard of hearing. It could be that there are multiple more cases, wow. But yeah, exactly. Like these are things that take a while for you to see these patterns. We didn't really come across resistance necessarily. One of the things that I did find interesting in one of the conversations that we had was with one of the experts was that even though law enforcement is not necessarily trained, even in bigger cities, to deal with these situations, they see them a little more often. I live in the Bay Area. We have a pretty sizable homeless population that intersects with mental health and drugs. So they see it, and then maybe on the streets, in that sense, they get trained. But when you're dealing with smaller police departments across the country, for example, the last one that took place in rural Indiana, where you can assume that law enforcement does not interact with this population as often as, for example, in bigger cities, that is something that they completely don't think of. And we can only, speculate what the officer with the canine was thinking, but he probably thought that, oh yeah, I can handle this by myself. And if I bring a dog, it might make it easier for him, not assuming that it actually made it worse. But every police expert that we consulted, whether they were in the film or not in the film, that we showed these cases to, specifically the last case, said that the officer had to wait and had to wait for backup in dealing with someone with a mental health crisis, and especially bringing a dog, that would only make it worse.
I will say that again, this is part of where it becomes this question. The question that you posed, Mary, is a vital one across the country. And what I believe Serginho, with his leadership, really wants the audience and law enforcement agencies to have that question really posed to them about where mental health does fit in the way they approach altercations, interactions with people. I can speak for Minneapolis, specifically based on my time with the Minneapolis Police Department, where there have been programs coupling mental health professionals with police officers that were successful for a period of time, but then wasn't funded fully, and then eventually was sunsetted. I believe this was maybe a little less than 10 years ago. But there are those conversations in play. But how municipalities actually support those, law enforcement, police unions, you name it, the importance of that conversation is obviously clear based on what we put together. Hopefully, this information, this data, the stories that we've gathered and put out to the public, we hope that will start that conversation again.
I know your time's important, but can we keep you on just a little bit?
No, they're going to stay till midnight. They're going to stay till midnight, Stan.
Well,
so we have lots more questions.
We have a lot more questions. So this is what I was wanting to address was legal terms, and this is one of the questions that someone's put out to us. Is it also seems that the fundamental problem during autopsy and how they are diagnosing the cause of death. So legal terms, during the autopsies, the legal terms kicked in. During the police reports, legal terms kicked in, and all the legal terms were very colorful. I don't think a police officer put those legal terms in the report. I think a lawyer put those legal terms in the report. And so can we discuss the autopsies and all the legal terms that are being thrown around?
I'm just going to quickly maybe tee Serginho up a little bit, if only to say there is so much in the way of death determination and the role of the medical examiner that we really weren't able to dive in full, such that I would even go as far to argue that there's a whole other film around the role of the medical examiner. I want to make sure you speak largely to this, Virginia.
Yeah, no, you're completely right. Like that's it's a whole world in and of itself. And what's the role of medical examiners? How close are they with law enforcement and with prosecutors? Also, like how, are they maybe intimidated or are they not intimidated? Are you dealing with a coroner system where someone can be elected to be a coroner and therefore the last one to sign off on a death certificate? If this person needs to be reelected, what kind of forces are there for that person to keep that in mind? Like, hey, I need to be reelected. I need to play ball maybe with city council or with the mayor. There's a lot out there.
I do think like Roger Mitchell is a very central voice, speaking openly about really calling a spade, in the way of what is diagnosed as a homicide, what is diagnosed as an accident, what is diagnosed like.
Is he the DC? I'm sorry to interrupt. Is he the DC?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, okay, absolutely. Yes, yeah.
All right.
And I believe it was one of the panelists from a previous talk here as well too, and we wanted to talk to him largely because he is willing to have that conversation and call out at times the problems when I wouldn't call it a misdiagnosis so much as if the medical determination as to how someone died, the power in that cascades across how a case is investigated. Now, I don't believe we feel comfortable in the report to be able to say, well, this is how badly these are, because we're not doctors and we're medical examiners, but we have people like Dr. Roger Mitchell who looks at this and say, I would have diagnosed this as A, B, C, or D, and that at times conflicts with the medical examiner in some of these cases. One of which was Hunter Turner's case that Dr. Mitchell did provide its perspective on. So, again, what we're hoping to do is open the door in the conversation to really looking at. So, in other words, the question posed, Stan, is very much the question that we're posing to law enforcement and medical examiners about the role and how much power there is in a medical in a death determination.
Amber, want to join in?
You're on mute. There you go.
My audio has been kind of low. Hopefully y'all can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. I just thought that the film was amazing. I really would love to show this to my classes moving forward, because one of the aspects that I did not realize was the use of ketamine, which is a tranquilizer, and the use of that to reduce manic behavior, right? But just how harmful that is, and how Mary was mentioning, how unethical it is, right? For police to take on the position of medical experts and induce individuals with these drugs when truly the need is for more mental health competency, I think, in the overall conversation. So I really, really appreciated the work that you all have done and just enjoyed the film through and through. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is enjoyed the right word, Amber?
I was surprised by the film through and through.
I'm gonna let you go, but let's do one more question before we let you go. It's has the number of in custody deaths stayed consistent over the years, or has it been declining or rising?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And it's a pretty hard question to answer because these were the cases that the AP were able to find. And the case they found were through public records requests. So they went to, a variety of public offices that deal with these types of debts and be able to get documentation to tally these debts. But there were certain places, Indiana is a very good example, where it's very hard to get any information. So we know that this is an undercount, but we have no idea by how many. And also, if we missed it per year, one of the things that you did see, but it's almost like almost natural, is that we did see an increase in the use of body camera footage in latter years, and also the fact that there were witnesses who filmed it with their cell phone. And it does show, it's not necessarily the answer, but it does give both those who investigate, but also the journalists and just the larger public, a better understanding of like how these incidents unfold and what happens. And actually it highlights how complicated many of these incidents are. They're not very black and white. It's not, as we probably have seen in other cases where someone fires a gun and that's it. There are cases where, for example, L. Clark, that he had an enlarged heart, that he was on cocaine. He used a lot of cocaine also in the weeks leading up to his death, where the experts, including the ones that we consulted off and on camera, all agreed, no, this was actually not the police's fault. However, that's very hard to kind of like figure out. And we also didn't have the body camera footage for quite a while. So we were in that sense kind of like, I wouldn't say trusting, but we were, we interviewed both the police officer. He was the only one who was actually really willing to go on camera, and a witness. And once we finally got the body camera footage, there were a couple of details that both the witness and the police officer in this case had it slightly wrong. But again, it shows the power of these visuals that you can see how this unfolded.
Yeah.
Imagine George Floyd without the video.
Exactly.
Oh, absolutely.
We have no way of imagining, right?
No, absolutely. I think that's the inherent with like the answer to the question is this is still information we're still pulling together. This has never been done before. The degree at which the AP has been able to gather the resources to get not only these cases, to evaluate these cases and the body cam footage as well as surveillance and dash cam is unprecedented in many ways. The only thing I wanted to sort of at least address, maybe not address so much, as ketamine, the use of it is definitely still like largely used by EMTs, and in a way we're starting to see a host of questions as to the use of it as well as what happened in these scenarios that could have led to death, because technically speaking, by the numbers, it still is a smaller percentage in the wider database. That being said, ketamine as a way of calming someone down has had negative effects, and clearly with Elijah McClain and Taylor Ware, as we saw, the need for real care and oversight on these very powerful drugs is probably something I think is a conversation to be had. That being said, we have like cases where, because ketamine has been under scrutiny, the use of Versed is another form of chemical restraint that isn't as effective but can be used dangerously as well too. So this is something that still needs to be explored a little bit, but by and large, ketamine, in terms of its ability to restrain safely, is actually still surprisingly safe. But how that's regulated, how that's not ordered by a police officer, I think that was probably the biggest problem. Not to mention, not only also to mention the dog being used in a mental health. That situation, frankly, so many things fell apart in that situation that it begs the question. And I believe, just to use your words, Serginho, we need to look at these cases, each of them, and see what those patterns are, where we could actually address these problems. But where are the patterns and where can we actually do to address? But I would even go as far as say the Taylor Ware case and Elijah McClain's case are good examples of things were not dialed in well enough for us to understand how egregious the consequences would be.
And yet the DA's response was nothing wrong took place, which is just so amazing to me. The use of the dog period was a bad move. And then the mother said when he came on scene, she said, get more help. One, the mother, she's not an officer, but she knew that he would need more help. And two, when he took the dog out of the car, the mother says, no dog, you don't need a dog, you need help, more hands-on. So I thank you both of you for a great film. That's fantastic. Job well
You guys
done.
are great. You're great.
Thank you very much.
Hey, thanks.
And we
thanks
want
to
dibs
Serginho's
on
leadership,
your.
truly. Yes.
Sorry.
Thank you.
We want
No, that's
dibs on your next project too. We
There
want to
you
be the
go.
first. We want to be
All
the
right.
first.
I'll definitely let you
Well
let you know
done.
when
Thank
it's
you
up.
so
We
much
got
for
you.
joining us.
We got
Good
you. No
luck in your
questions.
careers.
Thank
Thank
you.
you
I have
so
one
much,
more
Mary.
thing to
Oh,
note
please.
Go
is
ahead.
that this film is part of like a much larger project, as I mentioned before, Lethal Restraint. The database is public facing, so anyone can go out and just go and see the names and the people that that died, unfortunately. And I think you can filter as well, so you can see the people who've died and their death was attributed to excited delirium, for example. I think you can filter by state. And there are a bunch of other stories as well that were flown from this documentary and earlier reporting that we did. So yeah, please go and check that out. And we're still reporting. There's still I think there's still some stories going to come out. And I don't think I answered the question. Are we still adding names to the database? In the case that we do find names, we'll be able to add them. So yeah.
From filmmakers to investigators.
Exactly. Yes.
Thank you. And thank you for
All
joining
right,
us.
Thank you
guys.
so much.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
We'll see you
Thank
later.
Have a good one.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Are we meeting?
I don't know. Let's see if Jeremy sent something out.
Oh, Jeremy.
He's on the road.
Yeah, I know. I heard.
Jeremy,
Who's the CSUSB? Who's that? Is that George?
that's Jeremy.
No.
I don't know who
he
that
has
is.
2 screens?
I don't know who that
that's-
is.
It's Patino, I believe.
No, he's gone.
Just-
He has a
It
class.
just says CSUSB.
No,
Who's that then?
That's probably another tech.
Really?
Okay. Yes, it was. Okay, so I saw her name. Yes.
Oh, okay. All right, so we'll see you on the other side then.
Okay.
Well, that didn't sound right, huh?
Well,
See you on the other side. We'll
Conversations on Race and Policing has been supported by funding from the California State University San Bernardino College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, Pfau Library, and the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. Thin Lee is our technical consultant. Pamela Crossan provides administrative support, and Alan Yavor provides communication support. There's more information in the show notes, and please join us online at csusb.edu/CORP for upcoming programming and to find our catalog of over 100 past events with guests like Robin D.G. Kelly, Jabal Bowman, Dorothy Roberts, and many more.